Okay, well, you know the drill by now. The most recent book that I've read is Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. And this is the first big Tolstoy book I've read in a while. I very recently read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which I found to be really interesting. So I was kind of wondering if Tolstoy could maintain that level of quality, that level of interest for a longer work. Um, and it turns out the answer is no. Resurrection it's a really interesting concept for a book, I guess. The idea is that there's this sort of gallant young gentleman who uh this is all in the backstory. He basically gets some some woman pregnant, like his aunt's maid or something, gets her pregnant. And then abandons her. Not like has a committed romantic relationship with this woman, gets her pregnant, and then is like, okay, bye. Um, and the book opens like I think like 10, 15 years later when he's called to jury duty and he discovers that she is the accused in this situation. And I think the way that people generally pitch this book is that it's like, oh, he's coming face to face with the consequences that his actions have had on her. Like all of the consequences of his actions have fallen on her, and it's so like uh, destructive to him that it's so destructive to him that he completely changes. And I don't know. I think the way that this book is looked at, the way that it's talked about, is maybe a little bit incorrect because one thing, like Tolstoy is clearly an abolitionist. He's very clearly an abolitionist, and his politics are not hidden. I think it's just maybe inconvenient for certain types of people that he's like a master of world literature and also had these like very clearly like left-wing politics. Um, he makes it super duper clear that we should get rid of prisons. That prison is an institution that should not exist. And he makes it clear from the very beginning. The trial of this woman, like, here's the thing, right? Like, if Tolstoy were trying to tell a book, tell a story that's purely about how this guy's actions led to this woman's downfall, he wouldn't add all of this stuff about how unfair the judicial system is, because he has it so that it's very clear, actually, that this young woman getting arrested is more or less accidental. No one directly intends for her to be arrested and then exiled to Siberia. They only manage to do that via everyone else sort of refusing to take responsibility for what's happening. There's basically a clerical error that no one really feels that they can solve for a variety of reasons. There's a whole bunch of people who their attention is just elsewhere, so they don't really care. And it goes round and around in circles until it becomes clear that essentially this young woman is going to get sent to Siberia on accident. No one really intended for her to get sent to Siberia. She's accused of uh, theft and murder, I think, and they accidentally like I forget the details, but they accidentally acquit her of something that would highly imply uh 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 that she's also innocent of murder, but they don't actually state that she's innocent of murder. So the judge, who can perfectly well see that this is a nonsensical decision on the part of the jury, is like, okay. And then he doesn't really feel that he can overturn the decision of the jury, even though he can clearly see that it was made in error, because it's just not done, like it is done. Judges can overturn the judgments of juries, but there's sort of a political situation where it's felt that it's being done too often, and maybe this could lead to trouble for him, and he wants to go, see his mistress, and this is really going to hold up that whole cheating on his wife thing, and so he decides to just let this decision stand. And then Nick Kludov, the protagonist, tries to get it repealed, and there are similarly frustrating obstacles, and we end up with a situation where this young woman ends up going to Siberia because no one was able to stick their neck out and be like, "Hey, this doesn't make any sense." Um, and that's not a straightforward story about a guy who realizes that he's ruined this woman's life and then feels bad about it. You know, like there's extra steps here. Like, um, I mean, it is a story about a guy who feels bad that he's ruined this woman's life, but it's a story about a guy who starts from feeling bad about how he's ruined this woman's life, and the end point, the realization that he gets to, is that the criminal justice system is fundamentally evil, fundamentally evil. And Tolstoy does not mince words. He doesn't let you forget it. He comes back to this topic again and again and again, and somehow it's like a feature of his writing. Like his political perspective is a feature of his writing that we somehow just sort of hand wave away. Um, Even though I think this book is much better than Anna Karenina, which I read a few years ago, I don't think it's read nearly as much because Anna Karenina can be depoliticized, you know? It's a story about an affair, and Tolstoy's politics are tangential to that situation. So it can just be sort of ignored. Whereas here, Tolstoy is hitting you with his politics time after time after time. Oh boy, if you don't already know what Georgism is, this might not be the book for you. Because Nekhludoff, the protagonist, he's a noble, right? And he decides that he's going to return to his old ideas, which are Georgism. And Georgism is basically an idea about distribution of the land, that no one has a right, or at least as Tolstoy explains it, that no one has a right to own the land, and that the source of equality in an equal society would be equal ownership and access to the land. It's like communism for people who don't want to read Capital, but still want to be big nerds about it. So Nekhludoff becomes a Georgist. He decides to give all of his land to his peasants. There really a lot of the novel is dedicated to Nekhludoff's efforts to disentangle himself from the life that he's been living. It's really interesting because I wish there were sort of a modern version of this because usually we have in modern times I think we have stories where they end on a big realization. Like a character has a big realization about how their life needs to change, and then the process of change is just sort of implied, and then the movie ends, and we're to imagine, oh, they just, do the change. But this story is quite different in that it begins with that sort of revelation. Nekhludoff realizes in the first part of the novel that he needs to completely change his life, and the rest of the novel is about how he actually does that. And Tolstoy is willing to get into the details of like land inheritance. Um, and if you're not into that sort of thing, then maybe just read part one and then pretend that Nekhludoff, came to a big realization and then the book is over. Um, anyway, yeah, it's a really weird book. There's a couple of topics that I want to get into. The first is Tolstoy's presentation of women. Um, my God, it's weird. My partner is also reading a Tolstoy book. She's reading War and Peace because she's really, really smart. And I couldn't get through War and Peace. And one thing that she's talking about is that even though Tolstoy has so many women in his novels, um, he just doesn't know how to write them. And the thing is that, like, I don't know, sometimes people seem to sort of think that he does know how to do that, but he just sort of writes. It's very clear that, like, what he's writing is a fantasy of how he thinks women behave based on observing them in, like, um, like, different society from the one that we live in now. Like, he imagines I think he just fails to imagine. It's weird because, like, I want to say that he fails to imagine women complexly, but he does imagine women complexly. He imagines them very complexly, but he imagines them complexly in the way that one might imagine, like, a figment of their own, like, thought. a figment of their own imagination complexly. You know what I mean? Like he's taking he's just wrong about a lot of things. You know, he doesn't ever have a woman character, for example, who has this sort of internal depth where they see that society is flawed in some way, and they think about that deeply, and they're disturbed by it, and they come to some sort of conclusion about how things should be, and they work in some way towards moving in that direction. That's just not a thing that any of his female characters do, despite the fact that it's something that like a third of his male characters do, and pretty much all of his protagonists. It's so weird. It's very odd. It's sort of it's tough for me to describe because the women characters are really deep, but not as fully realized human beings. They're deep as fully realized explorations of Tolstoy's experience of being around women, um, which is really interesting in its own way. It's just not good. It's just not a fully realized female character. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't. Um, it doesn't really come together. And you would imagine, you would imagine that this would be a bigger problem for novels that have, for a novel like Anna Karenina, where like the titular character is a woman. And I guess I'd have to reread Anna Karenina to figure out exactly why it's not as much of a problem there. I think the thing is just that Tolstoy can write a very narrow range of like types of women, and that you have to maybe like read more than one or two female characters to realize that the only two characters that Tolstoy knows how to write are his sister and some whore, and that and that if he's working outside of that repertoire, his writing falls apart really quickly. Um, and I think in Resurrection he reaches sort of the height of his ability to write female characters by combining his two archetypes, his sister and some whore, into this character who is literally a prostitute, but whom we're supposed to feel um, very sympathetic towards. And what's weird, like there are so many things about this character that are really interesting, and then there are other things about this character that I think really gesture towards Tolstoy's limitations as a writer. Um, yeah, and I guess we should just get right into that. Like, first of all, I don't think that um, she doesn't have any sort of like complicated thoughts about her situation, which I think is a really big giveaway of for Tolstoy's like type of sexism, because she is, I'm tempted to say this book is almost like anti-standpoint epistemology, right? Because the female character whose name I'm totally forgetting, but the female character, the female lead in this book is perfectly positioned to understand all of the stuff, all of the like heady theoretical political stuff that Tolstoy is putting out there, right? She's a woman who was cast aside because of a perceived lapse in morality, um, and who has just fallen through the cracks of society, and the criminal justice system has caused her to against her will become a criminal. Like she does not have any real like inclinations towards criminality. It's just like, oh, you're a discarded woman. You have two options: become a criminal of some type or another, or literally fucking die. And she chooses the option that doesn't involve her dying. Um, she's very well positioned to understand all of these things because of her life experience, and it just doesn't occur to Tolstoy that she like would. She really doesn't. She doesn't demonstrate an understanding that goes beyond, man, this really fucking sucks, this is super unfair. No, it takes a man to come along and say like, oh yeah, this really sucks. Let me have some let me have some complicated thoughts about that, some complicated man thoughts about your situation. um and that's really fucking annoying. Like I was really hoping that these two characters were going to figure this stuff out together, but it's really not that. It's really more Nick Kludov figuring out all of this stuff based off of her experience, by the way. She is the one having the experience that sort of unveils the truth And it's just that Nikludov is the only one who can actually see the truth, you know? She needs this rich guy to come along and be like, oh, did you know that your situation being personally unfair for you actually has broader societal implications? And she's like, wow, you're so smart, Nikludov. I never would have thought of that. Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's just really fucking frustrating. I think if I were a woman, I would not be able to read Tolstoy. I think this constantly, because he has lots of women in his books, right? He focuses on them. He gives them big central roles, and then he just can't like get beyond uh, this very limited way of thinking about them. And I think constantly being exposed to that, if I were a woman, I just wouldn't like. Well, I wouldn't be able to read Tolstoy. Um, I would just get too frustrated and have to stop. Um, okay, there's some other things that are a little bit more disturbing. So the sex that the that Nikludov and this character whose name I'm totally forgetting have is highly implied to like not really be consensual. And this is an aspect of the book that is um, really interesting to me, but also very distasteful because you sort of have to decide how much of a cultural relativist you're willing to be about this, you know? Because this sort of concepts of sexual consent have changed a lot since the time the book was written. I don't think Tolstoy intended for his contemporary readers to read the scene with Nikludov and I forget her name, and to come away and say that's rape. That's a rape that I just read about. Um, but I think he did intend for them to understand that the sex that they have is something that Nikludov wants and that she doesn't want. Um, and you know, by modern standards, it's pretty unambiguous. Like we have a word for that. And the word is not, you know, consensual sex. Um, so yeah, that's one aspect of the book that is a little bit hard to get over because it presents this sex, this impregnation, as not consensual, and then it sort of has some very like retrograde 19th century ideas about that and what it means. And like I think Tolstoy wants us to understand that this is in no way like her fault. And I don't know, maybe he just goes a little bit too far in that point. Um okay, so anyway, there's a lot of the other like interesting tough to think about stuff about this book comes from the fact that this sex is definitely not consensual, and that the book has weird ideas about what that means. Because Nikludov's immediate conclusion when this lady is condemned to Siberia, his immediate idea that he sticks with for the whole rest of the book about how he's going to make this right is that he's going to do what he should have done, you know, when he was a child, when he was in love with this woman, which is to marry her. And Jesus fucking Christ, dude. Um, you know, like a lot of the things that he thinks that that will mean are good. Like he's like, yeah, I'm basically going to dedicate the rest of my life and however long it takes to making her situation in Siberia as comfortable as possible. And I'm going to make sure that she doesn't, you know, starve to death or suffer any of these bad things that happen to people when they get exiled to Siberia. But like, no, you don't like you ruin someone's life by raping them, and you can't fix that by marrying them. You know, like it's really messed up. And honestly, if you can't sort of just bracket that out and just think about this the way that a 19th century person would, like, oh yeah, that's great. He's, you know, finally making up for this terrible mistake he made. If you can't bracket out the rapey stuff, it's going to be really hard to read this book. Um, but it's interesting, and this kind of comes back to the Tolstoy like not being able to write female characters thing, because when Nekhludoff finally proposes to her, he she is like what the fuck? No, why would I want to marry you? And for just 1 second, I was like, oh my god, is Tolstoy cooking? Like, is he actually going to have her just say exactly what I'm thinking, which is like, you ruined my life by raping me. Like, why would I want to get married? Like, why would I want that? But no, that's not what he's doing. He's doing, if anything, the opposite of that. He makes it really, really clear that her distaste for him and her refusal to marry him, it comes more from self-hatred than it does from anything else. It comes from this feeling that she cannot be redeemed, rather than the more, I don't know, obvious and straightforward, fuck you, dude, you ruined my life and I hate you. Um, and I just, I just don't like it. I just don't think it's good. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. But this one particular aspect, which begins early on and is carried forward as a thread to the very fucking end. This is not a problematic element that comes up once or twice, and other than that, you can ignore it. The book is going to constantly remind you. This is a plot thread that carries through the entire novel. Um, and in fact, the ending is basically this woman continuing with her insistence not to marry Nekhludoff, even though it becomes increasingly clear that she really does love him and that that's what she wants for herself. But she has this sort of self-hatred that prevents her from doing that. And this is how Tolstoy looks on someone that we, like modern readers, would consider to be a victim of rape. Is that, oh, the reason she doesn't want to marry her rapist is because she's just too mired in self hatred to want to be happy. It's fucking disgusting. And it actually gets more disgusting when you consider the autobiographical elements of this story, because Tolstoy himself also had some what modern people would consider not consensual encounters. And I don't really know all of the details here, but Tolstoy was a landowner at the time before the abolition of serfdom, which means that he owned slaves. And some of those slaves bore him children. So, I don't think the analogy is like one to one with American slavery, but I still absolutely think that if you fucking own a person, you're not allowed to have sex with them. That's not allowed. You forbidden. That's not okay. So the parallels between Tolstoy's problematic attitude in this novel about non-consensual sex, that element, the problematic non-consensual stuff, is actually fucking 10,000 times worse when you think about this as a feature of Tolstoy's life, because it's not like this is something that he included but he didn't think about very much. He thought about this shit a lot. The fact that he uh, uh, and it's actually really clear from the book that a big part of this is autobiographical, like that he's working through stuff in his own life, and that his conclusion about all this, I guess, is that the thing that he did wrong was not the rape, but that he wasn't able to then marry these slaves that he had raped. Um, Weird. It's weird and gross and tough to think about, and it's not especially um, easy to disentangle from the like core fucking point of the book as well. Like, it's not like the problematic stuff is over here and the cool stuff is over here. They're very much mixed together. Um, yeah, I don't know. I really liked this book. I really enjoyed reading it, but it it's uh it's definitely not for everyone. I think if the core idea that I mentioned in the beginning of someone realizing that they need to completely change the way that they're living their life, and then rather than that being the end of the story, that's the beginning of the story, and they actually like achieve that goal, because that is also autobiographical. Like, Tolstoy also completely reinvented himself in his life, so he really knew what he was talking about there. I think if that core idea is appealing to you, then this is a good book, and I think um, and you will maybe potentially be able to look past the rest of it. Um, God damn. And let's see, do I have anything else to say about this weird rapey masterpiece? The thing that's horrible about it is that it's rapey on accident, and that it frames its own rapiness as in this sort of disingenuous and weird way. And I realize as I'm talking about it that I'm making it sound a lot worse than it actually is. Um, I get I don't know. I guess I'm really sensitive about sexual violence or something. But I think based on the passages that I actually read, I think most readers would read those and would not, the word rape would not immediately spring to mind the way that it did for me. So it's really not as graphic. It's not as graphic as I'm making it sound. But there is this element that I can't stop fucking thinking about. And I don't know if whether or not this is a good book for you to read will depend on how you think you will be able to grapple with that one element. Um, I also find okay, let's not end it on such a downer. I also find that Tolstoy's approaches to political economy are like very interesting, and the reason that they're interesting to me in the abstract is that the passages where he talks about political economy are actually kind of good. Um, like I think this is a really tough thing for writers to approach, you know, like we're going to talk about we're going to talk about the economy and we're going to talk about it in a political way. Like, isn't that great? Isn't everyone so excited? Isn't this such a fun novel? And Tolstoy manages to find a way where like those passages aren't the most exciting, but like for example, Nekhludoff decides that his peasants are going to inherit his land, right? And one problem that he really runs into is that the peasants have so much inbuilt suspicion for him and for all landholders that they straight up don't believe him. And that his very good like offers to them for how the land is going to be managed in the future are it's not that they don't understand, it's that they do understand and they assume that there must be some hidden catch that they're not getting. They believe by default that the only reason, and this is a very good heuristic for these people, that they believe by default that the only reason that the guy who owns the land that they work would ever have to want to renegotiate anything is so that he can screw them over even more efficiently than he was before. And so their default attitude is that anything that they agree to is always a trap, no matter how good it sounds. Um, and that's something uh, that our guy has a lot of trouble overcoming. Um, hmm. All right. Anyway, in summation, this book is very complicated. You know, now that I've spent almost half an hour talking about it, I think that I actually do understand why this is not the Tolstoy book that people jump to. Like, there is a lot to be said about this book. There's so much to be said about this book, but it's all really, really complicated and really, like a lot of it is really touchy, you know? Like some of the political economy stuff is communism adjacent in a way that I think would be very difficult to teach in, say, an American classroom. And um, the other like major thread here is pervaded by sexual violence, which is all would also be really hard to teach. And I think that in comparison to that, it's a lot easier to just find something, nice and friendly without any like very sharp edges, like Anna Karenina, and just read that instead. So yeah, the resurrection. Uh, not even I know whether or not this is a good book. That's what I have to say about it.